42 to 41% with 1.5 million votes almost. Humphrey has 36% of the vote, 1,286,000, and Wallace 23% of the vote, 817,000. CBS News estimates that in Connecticut, important state of Connecticut, Hubert Humphrey, when all the votes have been counted, will win with 50% of the vote. Richard Nixon will get 43% and Wallace 7% in Connecticut. Connecticut will be in Humphrey's column. In West Virginia, also, CBS News estimates that Humphrey will win there with 56% of the vote, Nixon 37%, and Wallace 7% of the vote. Mike Wallace?
In Connecticut, Walter, Hubert Humphrey has done a good deal better than expected for those 8 electoral votes in that state. He won in every area but normally high Republican areas and in some of the rural and small town areas of Connecticut. Going into today's election, the state was considered a toss-up, but Humphrey, according to the CBS News estimate, as you said, gets 50%, Nixon 43%, Wallace just 7%. And that is somewhat less than the Wallace people had hoped for in the state of Connecticut. And there's an interesting note in Connecticut. The vice president carried more than 3/4 of the Negro ghetto areas, but he also carried more than half of the expected backlash vote in the state of Connecticut. In West Virginia, on the basis of about a half of our sample precincts now, Humphrey the winner, Humphrey receiving 56% of the vote, Nixon 37%, Wallace just 8% for the time being. Anyway, in West Virginia, I say only 8%, Wallace is not making the inroads that he would need among blue-collar and low-income voters, or that he had expected in order to get the 18% of the total that some observers had predicted ahead of time that Wallace would get. In New Jersey, with half of our sample precincts in, and that's a big state for both candidates, Nixon and Humphrey. As you can see, according to the tabulated vote, with just 3% in, Humphrey and Nixon are just about tied and Wallace well down. But with half of our sample precincts in, it remains too close to call. This is a state that Nixon had counted on, but Humphrey is running very well in Newark and other large cities, doing extremely well in the Negro ghetto areas. Evidently, they have been successful up to now in getting out the Negro ghetto vote. Wallace's biggest strength so far is in the backlash areas of Newark and Jersey City. In the state of Vermont, Richard Nixon leading.
Where Wallace was supposed to do particularly well, I mean, not just in the East, across the entire country, show that Wallace is not doing as well as expected. He's getting about 11% of the vote in those blue-collar workers areas. Humphrey is actually getting 48%. Nixon is getting 41%. Perhaps a little better than the Republican candidate would normally do in the blue-collar areas. But at least, according to this, Wallace is not doing as well as he expected, and Humphrey apparently is not doing as well as a Democratic candidate normally would do in those areas. We have 6% of the national popular vote in now, with 41% for Nixon, 23% for Wallace, and 36% for Humphrey. 5% split there between Nixon and Humphrey. Wallace running at 23% with this small total of votes in from the country as a whole, and many precincts still open. CBS News color coverage of Election Night 68 will continue in a moment.
The Cody people have Gloucester. So even though it's sheer, it lasts. Now, wouldn't it be silly to put something this great into a tacky old case? Look. The first new lipstick in years. Topless lipstick by Cody Originals.
A razor blade is straight, and your face isn't. To get around this problem, we introduced the Norelco triple header with 3 new microgroup heads that float. In an independent laboratory test, the Norelco triple header shaved as close or closer than a blade in 2 out of 3 shaves. And then there's a pop-up trimmer. The Norelco triple header for men who can't keep a straight face when they shave. You can't get any closer.
In the electoral vote, where it counts. It takes 270 electoral votes to win the presidency. You know that popular vote only determines where the electoral votes go state by state. CBS News has estimated now that Nixon will win Kentucky, Florida, North Carolina, and Indiana for a total of 49 electoral votes. Humphrey will win Connecticut and West Virginia for a total of 15. Wallace will win Alabama for a total of 10. And now CBS News says that in Kansas, according to our sample precincts Nixon should win that heavily Republican state with 57% of the vote, Humphrey 35%, and Wallace 8% in Kansas. That adds to the Nixon total some 7 electoral votes for Kansas, which would bring him to a total of 56 electoral votes on our board. Nixon is also leading in Missouri, Vermont, Tennessee, Texas. Humphrey's leading in Illinois, Michigan, Massachusetts. Dan Rather, can you give us a report from the Middle West? Perhaps some of your Senate races have some importance for us now.
Right, Walter, we'll get to those Senate races in a moment, but things are breaking so quickly on the presidential race in the Midwest that I think we'd better go with that first. Kansas, as you pointed out, CBS News now estimates that Richard Nixon will carry the state of Kansas, although the raw vote figures in Kansas, let's take a look at those, show Nixon out front of Humphrey and George Wallace third. CBS News, I repeat, and you see the check mark beside Richard Nixon's name, estimates that Richard Nixon will carry Kansas. Now, we're beginning to get substantial reports from our sample precincts, at least in Michigan, but first let's take a look at the actual counted vote in Michigan. Michigan, one of the prizes of the Midwest, with 21 electoral votes, only 1% of the actual vote tabulated. Those are the figures: Humphrey out front, Nixon second, and Wallace third. Now, the CBS News estimate in Michigan, with nearly 1/3 of our sample precincts reporting, Humphrey is leading, and due in large part to the low number of votes in the Wallace column in Michigan. In the backlash areas, for example, Humphrey is doing much better than expected in Michigan, and the Wallace vote is a good deal smaller than had been predicted. Too early to say in Michigan, but Humphrey is leading in Michigan. In Missouri, our first real total, substantial totals of the night coming in, with 2% of the vote in. There you see the figures. Humphrey leading, Nixon second, Wallace running a poorer third than many people would have thought. Keep in mind, this is the actual tabulated vote, only 2% of it counted. However, our CBS News estimates indicate that Missouri, with 12 electoral votes, is trending toward Nixon. Despite the actual tabulated vote, with only 2% of it in, our CBS sample precincts indicate that with a little less than half of our sample precincts reporting that Nixon appears to be leading Humphrey by about 52 to 38%, with the missing 10% going for George Wallace. And again, the indication is George Wallace may not be running as well in Missouri as he and many of his followers had expected. In that critical Ohio race, let's take a look at the raw vote figures there. The actual tabulated vote in the state of Ohio, with 12% of the vote counted. Those are the figures: Nixon leading, Humphrey second, George Wallace running third. We want to keep on reporting on that critical Ohio presidential race because Mr. Nixon figures he has to have Ohio, and the indications remain that Nixon and Humphrey are running a breathtaking neck-and-neck race there. And Walter, that seems to be the picture all over the Midwest. It's a real dogfight, difficult to tell who's on top.
It's interesting that in West Virginia, Hubert Humphrey ran a stronger race in West Virginia than John Kennedy did in that state 8 years ago.
Got a lot in there.
And this is quite a historic footnote, inasmuch as it was West Virginia's victory for John Kennedy in the primaries 8 years ago that knocked Hubert Humphrey out of the race for the presidential nomination in that year of his Democratic Party. Now he's running better than Kennedy did in West Virginia, and Wheeling, he ran far ahead of the Kennedy victory percentages. It seems that the chief Wallace effect in West Virginia has been to take votes from Nixon rather than from Humphrey. We'd like to remind you that only half of the states have closed their voting places up to now. In fact, at 8:30, it was just a little over half, with Arkansas joining the closed states for a total of 26. 24 states, so the polls are still open, although we're making estimates on the basis of early returns from our sample precincts on winners in some of these states. This does not mean that the votes in other areas are at all unimportant. In fact, in many cases, they're critical, and certainly will be as far as your state races go for the Senate and the House of Representatives and your local legislatures. Now, Roger Mudd from the South.
Walter, Virginia is a key state in the South to determine the general strength of George Wallace and Hubert Humphrey. On our first returns there in Virginia, 12% of the popular vote is in. Nixon is leading, and apparently leading quite easily. Our model precincts indicate that Nixon will carry the entire Richmond area and the northern Virginia suburbs in Arlington and Alexandria. It's also interesting to report that in the Virginia high Democratic voting areas, that is men and women who normally vote a straight Democratic ticket, today, 1 out of every 2 Democrats is voting for Richard Nixon. In Tennessee, in the presidential race, with just over half the popular vote in, Richard Nixon still maintaining his lead there. Apparently, Wallace is getting boxed in more and more as these returns come in, boxed into the deep, deep South. And finally, in Georgia, with 7% of the popular vote in, Wallace there is leading 42,000 to 18,000 for Nixon, Humphrey 24,000. So, Walter, it looks like tonight that Wallace's strength will be confined by these returns from Kentucky and Virginia and Tennessee and Florida to the Dixie Crescent that goes from Georgia down to the Gulf Coast.
Taking another section of the country, the far northeast, Yankee land up in Vermont, that state house has been returned, according to our CBS News estimate, to the Republicans. Dean Davis, 67-year-old Montpelier insurance executive, has defeated, according to our CBS News estimate, John Daly, the 45-year-old lieutenant governor of Vermont, a state house that had been held by Philip Hoff, who is retiring after 3 terms. CBS News estimates that Davis wins the governorship in Vermont. Eric Severide, I wonder if on the basis of these early returns yet tonight, any way to, the future is casting any shadows in the Democratic Party in the South?
Well, I think it's clearly doing that. That part of the country. It would seem to me that on the basis of what we know now from these figures, that the South becomes even more than ever a distinctly different political organ in the national body politic. It's going to be conservative Nixon, all the way over to very conservative Wallace. The old Democratic apparatus there for the last 40 years or more is just about all gone. North Carolina apparently is going to go Republican. If it does that, according to our research here, it would be the first time it's gone Republican since Herbert Hoover's days. It seems reasonable to speculate that we're not going to have a landslide, at least in the popular vote, as between the 2 leading candidates of the major parties. The early polls in mid-September, for example, that indicated a 16% spread as between Nixon and Humphrey never did seem to make much sense to many people. It would be way out of the pattern of American voting, particularly when the 2 candidates come essentially from the mainstream of American political life. It's very rare to break down that way. 64, 4 years ago, was not a normal apposition at all. I would think that if Mr. Humphrey is counting on picking up 2 or 3 big Midwestern states to offset Mr. Nixon this time, then he must be a bit nervous about it as of this hour tonight. Missouri looks very shaky from what I've heard you report, and one would think he would have to take Missouri if he were going to do very much in the Midwest, comparable to what Mr. Truman did in '48 when those Midwest states went to him the last couple of weeks of the campaign and offset what Dewey was doing in New York, for example. This would look a bit shaky, I would think, for Humphrey in the Midwest. Walter?
Hadn't all of the estimates been built, though, Eric, pretty much on the Midwest going solidly Nixon in the past?
No, but I think the Humphrey hopes came down to that.
Make a breakthrough in Missouri, anyway.
Well, that one they needed, they thought.
Those early returns that Dan was reporting to us a little earlier from there usually are from St. Louis and from Kansas City, which are heavy Democratic areas, and very possibly Republicans will run stronger there as more returns come in. Speaking of speaking of Republicans in the South and the future of the Democratic Party there, Eric, Senator Strom Thurmond has played a very important part in this political campaign this year. He was the former Democratic senator from South Carolina who went over to the Republican Party after a brief flirtation with his own political party, the state's writers, the Dixiecrats of 1948, and then this year played more or less of a part in the nomination of Richard Nixon, depending on whose stories you read and listen to. We hear is about to leave Columbia, South Carolina by charter plane. He's going to fly up to New York to be at the Waldorf Astoria tonight, come what may, and of course he's anticipating victory. CBS News color coverage of Election Night 68 will continue in a moment.
This man has all the trappings of a second-class citizen because he lives in a city. And anyone living in a city, no matter how prosperous, has to live with the bad air, the bad traffic, bad rivers and harbors, bad race relations, bad crowding, bad litter, bad crime rate, bad news. And that's certainly not first class. So who is first class? The Institute of Life Insurance, representing the life insurance companies in America, believes we all should be. It can report that life insurance companies are investing $1 billion to help rehabilitate slums and create new jobs in our cities, as its part in helping make our cities first class. A lot of other people are working in that direction. If you care to join the effort, write for this free booklet to Crisis, care of Postmaster, New York, 10001. Concern. That's first class.
7% of the nation's precincts have reported now, and it is holding steady as it has now for the last 15 or 20 minutes, with Nixon at 41%, Humphrey at 36%, and Wallace at 22%. For a very brief moment there, Humphrey had closed the gap to a 4% margin. He was up to 37%, but now with some late figures, he's back down to 36%. Of course, this is a very scattered group of returns, only 7% of the nation in. CBS News estimate now on the presidential race in Georgia. CBS News estimates that when all the votes are counted in that southern state, George Wallace will pick up Georgia with 49% of the vote. Humphrey coming in second with 27%, and Nixon 24%. 12 electoral votes for George Wallace in Georgia to add to his 10 in Alabama. And a CBS News estimate in Vermont. CBS News figures show that when all of the count has been made, Nixon will win in Vermont by 57% of the vote, Humphrey 40%, and Wallace 3%. Nixon thus adds Vermont's 3 electoral votes to his total to bring his total to 59. Wallace has a total of 22 now, and Humphrey, with his wins in Connecticut and West Virginia, as we at CBS News see it, has 15 electoral votes. And now, with some more added on to Humphrey's popular vote, he has closed the gap to 4%. He's run up to 37%, and Nixon 41%, and Wallace 22%. At Nixon headquarters, Bill Plant is with the key Nixon aide, Bob Finch, from California. Bill?
Walter, as you know, Bob Finch who is the Lieutenant Governor of California, is a close friend and aide of Richard Nixon's. In 1960 was his national campaign director. Bob, are you concerned at all about the outcome of this?
I have a strange sense of detachment about this one, unlike 60 when it was such a horse race. And I know I'm willing to say right now we'll flatly win. I think we'll be in excess of 360 electoral votes. Well, as I say, it's a different ballgame than in 1960.
What sense of concern has there been in the Nixon camp over the last-minute Humphrey surge and the bombing halt?
Well, of course, the bombing halt was an event that whose aftermath you couldn't predict. I think most Americans felt instinctively that it was done for political reasons, but...
of course, Mr. Nixon disagreed with you on that publicly.
Yes, that's right. We did disagree, and I was trying to report what I thought the political effect was of that event. And I think probably it's helped him in the New England area. It probably reflected in that Connecticut vote. On the other hand, we're very pleased because we've got the insurance states of Kentucky, Tennessee, Florida. I think we'll get Texas, states where we're in some question.
So which are you watching for now as your key states?
Well, we'll watch Pennsylvania, we'll watch Ohio, we'll watch Michigan. But as I say, I predict victory.
Governor or Lieutenant Governor Finch, if this campaign were to be run again, would you advise Mr. Nixon to do it at all differently?
No, sir. I think this has been a sound campaign, well constructed. We put together a good ball club when we went into the primaries, as Jack Kennedy did in 1960, and I wouldn't change a thing, Bill.
Thanks very much for being with us.
Back here at our CBS News election headquarters, we've got an analysis. Well, you see 8% of the vote is in now. Wallace has dropped 1% to 21%. Nixon and Humphrey holding their relative positions of 41 and 37%. We now have Nixon with 59 electoral votes won, according to our CBS News estimate. Humphrey 15 and Wallace 22. Nixon also is leading in Oklahoma, South Carolina, Tennessee, and Virginia. Humphrey is leading in Illinois, Michigan, Massachusetts, and the District of Columbia. And taking a look at the city vote, Nixon is running slightly below his strength in the big cities in 1960, and Humphrey is running ahead of John Kennedy's big city vote of 1960. This is Walter Cronkite at CBS News Election Headquarters.
This is CBS.